Gorge.
I'm Cathy Glasson, opinion editor for the Register, and we're here for an interview with John Norris. He is one of 6 candidates for the Democratic nomination for governor. The winner of the June 5th primary will face Republican Governor Kim Reynolds in November. John, welcome to the Register.
Thanks, great to be here.
With me here is Carol Hunter, executive editor, and Brianne Pfannenstiel, who is covering politics in the governor's race. And we may have another join us at some point, but let's go ahead.
Very good.
John, tell us about yourself and especially what you think qualifies you to be governor of Iowa.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. What qualifies, about myself, I'll start with myself. I'm a Southwest Iowa farm kid. Grew up in the farm my great-great-grandparents settled. I've worked throughout my life in public policy and activism and government. I was the state director of the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition during the farm crisis in the 1980s. Worked for Tom Harkin out of college. And one of my proudest moments in politics is being on Tom's first U.S. Senate campaign. Without Tom in the U.S. Senate, we wouldn't have the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's changed the lives for so many Iowans, so many Americans. I was in the restaurant business for a while in Greenfield, Iowa. I like to tell people, if you're thinking about going in the restaurant business, talk to me before you do it. But it was great fun being active in that Greenfield community. I was the state chair of the Democratic Party in 1998 when we elected Tom Vilsack, the first Democratic victory in Iowa in 32 years. And I had the opportunity to serve as Tom Vilsack's chief of staff. So I do have some experience in cleaning up messes left by Terry Branstad. We're going to have a bigger one in 2019. I also did Tom's energy policy when he was governor, and helped develop the legislation that led to Iowa's build out in the wind industry, and he subsequently appointed me chairman of the Iowa Utilities Board. When I left the Iowa Utilities Board in 2009, we were the national leader in energy efficiency, one of my most proud accomplishments there, and also just on the cusp of being the national leader in renewable energy. So President Obama appointed me to the Federal Energy Commission to advance the cause against climate change across the country with renewable energy and energy efficiency. In the interim, for the year while I was being held up in the U.S. Senate, I got to be the chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and helping Tom Vilsack again, this time with managing a staff of over 100,000 and over $100 billion budget. What I'm most proud of my work there is we began to change some of the culture of USDA to not just be about industrial scale agriculture. We funded local foods and farmers markets across the country and put people's gardens in every USDA office to reconnect Americans to who raises our food and how it's raised. In the last 2 years, before Jackie and the boys and I returned home, I was the U.S. representative to the United Nations for agricultural policy. So that's my background. And I believe we're in a situation today in the state of Iowa where, with our budget so mismanaged, and the deficits we're in now, and the underfunding of so many critical needs like education and mental health care, that Iowans looking for someone who has some experience in managing, and I have done that at the state and federal level at the highest levels. Always advocating for the little guy, and we have too much focused on corporate welfare today and not looking out for Iowans.
What do you think is the most urgent problem? You listed some problems. What do you think is the most urgent problem facing the state of Iowa, and what would you do about it?
Well, urgent being the operative word. I think because we have to treat it as urgent, but there's a lot more contributing factors that long term we have to address, and that is mental health care. We are hemorrhaging with the lack of mental health services. I hear it everywhere I go. Every community is impacted by it, nearly every family. And we have a number of Iowans in crisis and nowhere to go. It's affecting our law enforcement, affecting our workforce, affecting families. So we've got to have a mental health system as soon as possible that can address the needs. Now, again, there are contributing factors to that that are leading to it that are more long-term, like education, like incomes, recognizing the trauma that so many families are in because of economic stress, or our new immigrants are being stressed out as well, and that's contributing to the mental health problem. So we've got to get long-term at the underlying causes of a lot of our mental health illness.
The legislature took some action, some first steps on mental health this year. What do you think are the next steps, or where did they fall short?
Well, I was pleased that they took action because I think it's a recognition that no one can miss if they're traveling throughout the state and talking to Iowans. So at least there was recognition The problem is there's no funding behind it. And with symbolism, until you have funding behind it, you're not going to address these issues. We have to have an expectation for each of our 14 regional mental health systems in the state of what is a continuum of care that they're all expected to provide. And then empower them to do it in the most efficient way possible based on the needs and constructs of their region. But we have a mental health funding system based on an antiquated property tax system that dates clear back to the old county homes, where property tax supported the county homes. And now those counties are locked into the 1996 levels, over 20 years old of funding freeze. And it's causing disparity in what each county contributes to those regions. So it's making them unable in many instances to be able to work together because of the disparity in funding.
So do you eliminate the cap or go away from property taxes as the major source of funding altogether?
I think the first order of business is to eliminate the cap and levelize what each county is putting in, so we're all contributing equally per capita. Long term, we have to develop a funding stream for mental health and take the burden off the property tax, because mental health transcends county boundaries now. Like I said, it's not like the old county home. And we need a dedicated revenue stream of general fund expenditures to help supplement the mental health needs of those 14 regions. We didn't even touch on children's mental health, which is non-existent in this state.
Yeah, so but what does a funding stream look like long term? Are you talking about a dedicated revenue stream, or are you talking about saying, okay, we're going to carve out a piece out of the general fund within, the income tax and sales tax? Or do you create a new source of revenue? I
think we have to look at a general fund expenditure that meets those 14 regions' needs to make sure that continuum of care is provided. Okay. And we have to, the lack of, we always cite the statistic we're last in the nation in acute care beds available. And we have a lot of critical care access hospitals in Iowa that are really few beds being occupied. So why not utilize that existing infrastructure, empower those regions to work with some those critical access hospitals, and dedicate a psychiatric wing in some of those, so you keep mental health patients closer to their community and their family, and we leverage that existing access of those beds available throughout the state.
Would something need to happen would the state have to provide incentives there, or do you have to back off the certificate of need system, or are there regulatory barriers to that happening?
No, we have, Atlantic's got 4 psychiatric beds available in their hospital right now. There's another hospital in the state, rural hospital, that has that. I can't recall the name of the town. So it's working with those hospitals and see which ones are interested, and providing the necessary resources for them to convert to a psychiatric wing, which requires some physical changes and staffing up, and that's what we have to work with the regions to fund to enable those hospitals to be able to provide that service.
You've been talking about yourself as the candidate really most in tune with rural Iowa. You've had a lot of background at the state and federal level in agriculture. As you've traveled around the state and observed communities and talked to voters, what have you concluded that rural Iowa needs the most from the state of Iowa, and what would you do about it?
Well, I would first say that we hear a lot of talk about a rural-urban divide, and the more pressing need is the increasing divide between the haves and have-nots and the economic disparity in our state, and that transcends our urban areas and rural areas. But that's one of the contributing factors to the decline of rural Iowa, is low wages and low income. But every rural community knows that they have to have a good school and good hospitals in each one of those counties, or they might as well turn the lights out. With the Medicaid privatization, we're putting serious stress on our rural hospitals and their ability to deliver health care. With the underfunding of education and the stripping away of collective bargaining rights for teachers, we are really going to struggle to attract teachers into rural Iowa. Minnesota's advertising right now for our young teachers. And so we've got to meet those challenges first as those anchors for rural communities. Then you have 22% of Iowans don't have access to broadband. 12 counties, over 40% of the population. That's really the FDR's RA of our time. If you're going to have if you're going to have economic development in rural communities, you've got to have access to broadband. So people expect to and should expect to be able to transact business anywhere in the world. I think the population growth in the farm sector in rural Iowa is going to be through smaller, diversified, sustainable farming operations. We're always going to be a big commodity production state. We're not going to roll back this concentration of ag production anytime soon on the commodity side. But when I was at the Practical Farmers of Iowa convention in Ames in January, there were 1,000 farmers there. I'd say half of them under the age of 40. Some even moved to Iowa because of our land and natural resources, looking to make a living through diversified, sustainable agriculture.
Do we have enough markets available? Is there enough support to help those farmers find markets for the things that they feel like they want to grow? So what do you do about that?
Well, first of all, while we're expanding business tax credits last year, they cut the beginning farmer tax credit program in half, which is just wrong-headed, because that's where we need to help address the needs of repopulating rural Iowa. You need to re-gear our beginning farmer programs and target marketing operations and processing, so you create economies of scale for those new, small, diversified farms to flourish and get them profitable, ramp that up. And that means creating an infrastructure by which they can create markets and processing that enable them to be profitable.
You mentioned, rural schools. The trend for a long time, including during the Vilsack administration, was toward consolidation, fewer schools, and frankly, fewer kids in rural Iowa. So, how do you reverse that trend? What's your model for education in rural Iowa?
So, you reverse the trend by targeting our economic development efforts to rural areas to create job and opportunities out there. Again, repopulating the farm site with smaller, diversified farms. Those are younger farmers going to have families. Expand broadband access, so you create the opportunity for small businesses to settle and start in rural Iowa, which is really the backbone of our economy, are small businesses. And we've got to be more welcoming for immigrants. The rural communities that are growing and whose schools are growing are those communities who have welcomed and are receiving new immigrant population. That's where the growth is in our rural sector. So we got to focus on rebuilding the rural Iowa economy and regrowing rural communities, and then a lot of your consolidation efforts for schools goes by the wayside. And in the meantime, we have to make sure that those rural schools have the resources. So we have to make sure that there's funding available for the additional costs of operating rural schools, particularly transportation costs, are much more expensive. And we have to recognize that and say that every student in Iowa, no matter that rural or urban, should have a chance to succeed. And we have to make up for those differences in added expenditures on the transportation side. And then on our low-income schools, both rural and urban, they have a disproportionate amount of their resources going to free and reduced lunch, for paying for textbooks for children, and costs that aren't accommodated for in our school funding to help levelize what's going to the education delivery.
Does that require changing the funding model for education? Right now the money follows the students. You're talking about additional help for areas where there are fewer students, at least at first.
We need an adjustment factor that recognizes those high transportation costs and those low-income schools that are spending money on items that the higher income areas don't have to spend on, because their students and families can afford those services or those needs, and make sure that we adjust that so all students get an equal opportunity.
So that sort of poverty factor, would that apply to urban areas
yes,
as well?
Absolutely. Hey, we've got 3 elementary schools right here in central Des Moines. And this is a broader issue, when we get these broader issues, the housing issue. But the turnover in each classroom is 60% a year. So if you're a elementary school teacher, 60% of your class is different at the end of the year than what you started with. And many of those students are going to multiple schools throughout the year. They're just one step ahead of the eviction notice or moving from family to family because they can't afford housing. The challenges for those students to get a quality education are so much greater, and we're not addressing it. We know that students who aren't on free and reduced lunch read at 90% proficiency at the 3rd grade level. Students who are on free and reduced lunch read at 57% proficiency at the 3rd grade level. we've got to target that. We shouldn't have been eliminating the summer reading program for third graders. We should be targeting that for how do we help break that cycle of poverty for those children.
Some of the other candidates have talked about early pre-K education. Is that something that you would support, universal preschool?
Absolutely. Data shows that if you get children in an early pre-K, fully funded, all-day pre-K, they're going to have a greater chance of success. And again, it's an investment that pays off in the long run with fewer people on public assistance, fewer children with mental health needs, more children that are able to get job training skills or go on to college and increase their ability to earn, and which we desperately need for our businesses in this state who are starving for workers, and we're leaving too many children behind that aren't breaking through that barrier.
What about at the other end of the educational experience? There's been discussion about should state of Iowa have, for example, free community college tuition, or significantly subsidized community college tuition for people going into certain skilled trades. Is that a priority for you?
Yeah, we know about half of our children right now aren't going on to college. So for those, we need to make sure that they're getting a job skill and life skills training in that junior and senior year of high school. And like Colorado's doing, I want them earning a paycheck before they get out of high school so they can see an economic path forward, because too many of them are making life choices that are making them less employable or unemployable. The number of manufacturers and businesses around the state that the percentage of the applicants that can't pass a drug test is frightening in this state, which is a combination of factors of those children not having hope, not having children's mental health system, and not giving them the training to see a path forward. For those children who want to go on to college, and we want to encourage them to, we have to bring down tuition rates at our regions and community college institutions, and we should increase the tuition assistance available for low-income families. As I cross the state, the number one issue I hear is lack of mental health services. The second most dominant issue is our businesses that can't grow are turning down orders because they can't find workers. And we're leaving too many workers on the table by not investing in their education, in their health care, and mental health care that enable them to provide that workforce and break that cycle of poverty. It ties into caregiver services and child care assistance as well.
How does wanting to have more high school kids employed in jobs square with the idea of raising the minimum wage? The concern is that, in areas where the minimum wage has gone higher, that it's teenagers who get squeezed out of the job market.
So I view them separately. We need to increase earning capacity of our students who aren't going on to college, and that's job training skills that are paired with the local economy. What do those manufacturers and businesses need? And tailor those programs in those high schools, working with the community colleges to make sure we are providing those students opportunities to choose and giving them the skills training they need to increase their earning capacity. No one aspires to make minimum wage, but we need to have a minimum wage that lifts people off of public assistance and gives them the dignity of being able to support themselves. And that's why I've advocated for tying the minimum wage to 130% of the poverty level index for a family of four, so that we get people earning and able to support themselves through their work, not through public assistance.
And are you advocating a $15 an hour?
130% of poverty for a family of four is $15.37 an hour. And at a minimum, we should, at a minimum, get that up there over 5 years, sooner if we can. But that'll obviously engage the legislative process, and start with larger employers first. But obviously, if larger employers are paying a more competitive wage because we set the minimum wage higher, it's going to be harder for smaller businesses to attract workers. So I think it'll drive everyone up to a competitive wage. I was a restaurant business owner. And a lot of small businesses say, well, we can't afford that. Well, when I had my restaurant in Greenfield, I competed with Toad and Martha's Cafe, and I competed with John and Wanda's. If we're all lifting our wages the same, no one's at a competitive disadvantage. But there's more people going to come to my restaurant and buy hamburgers. So that's how I look at it.
How do you apply the minimum wage to wait staff who currently are exempted because they collect tips?
Right, you adjust that up as a proportion of their revenue they receive from tips, so it stays in the same ratio. I wish we had the European system where they didn't have tipping, and they paid their workers a competitive salary and benefits, but that's probably not going to change anytime soon.
As a small business owner, what was your experience with providing health insurance for employees, and what are the challenges you see? We talked a little bit about mental health, but what are the challenges you see overall with the healthcare system that you feel like would be a high priority to address as governor?
Well, we'll set aside the Medicaid system for now in case you want to get into that. But I have advocated, Senator McCoy and Representative Forbes offered legislation this year that would provide a Medicaid opt-in. So individuals who can't get afford in the marketplace but are above that 400% level of poverty would get assistance or be able to opt into Medicaid. So they are not. So we create some competition in the marketplace for those.
Does that then function basically as a public option?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
We have, not that it's not a huge issue, but we have 4% of Iowans without health insurance. I forget, we're one of the lowest states in the nation. We have 155,000 Iowans without health insurance. And some of those are the invincible. We need to encourage them to opt into the ACA or to get insurance. And we have to, I think, provide that Medicaid option.
Invincibles are people who are young and healthy.
That's right.
What you're saying? Okay.
That's right.
And when you were a small business owner, did you provide health insurance for your employees? No. So what do they do? Spouses, or how do they get health insurance?
Spouses or individuals, their individual policies. That was 1988 to 1992, which was a bit of a different environment I do for my employees now.
Yeah.
We provide health insurance.
What did you do for your own family? Did you?
I didn't have a family when I was in the restaurant business.
Okay.
I was single and had my own health insurance policy.
You had your own health insurance.
I was invincible back then too, so it was some kind of high deductible.
Do you remember
policy.
what you paid for it?
No, I don't. But I can't imagine it was more than $100 a month.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was about somewhere in that range. Yeah, it was unbelievable. That's 30 years ago.
That was 30. I didn't realize that was that long.
Yeah.
So okay. We've talked about expansion of education, expansion of healthcare. You were one of the few people at the debate last night who raised your hand and said you would repeal the income tax increase that was passed during the legislature. Were you not?
It was an income tax increase.
I mean,
yes.
income tax cut.
Yeah.
Sorry, income tax cut, and start over.
Yes.
So, how do you restructure the tax structure so that you can pay for these priorities that we've just been discussing?
So yeah, I think we start over. There were some elements that I think we need to put in a new package. Certainly the sales tax on internet sales, which I think levelizes competition for our retail businesses in Iowa. I think that was a positive.
You don't think that was too? Some Democrats said no, that was too regressive.
It is regressive, but again, you got to balance the special deals and try and make this overall tax system fair. What we have today are too many loopholes, too many. Back in the 80s, we talked a lot about capturing tax cheats. They don't cheat anymore. They just hire corporate lobbyists and get a special deal. And so we've got to look to keep rates low across the board, but stop the back-end deals that are creating all of these special tax credits and exemptions. So there are a number of things we need to do. One is, I think, you keep that sales tax. You take it off of those services that oftentimes serve the poor, like the Uber cabs and some of those services that poor depend upon, not increase what they're paying for that. We can't pass on this $304 million cost of this commercial industrial property tax break that we gave back in 2013, that now the state is going to start next year, or have indicated next year they're going to start backing out of those commitments to county and local government. If we're not going to backfill, we have to reverse that 10% cut from 100% to 90% of valuation for commercial industrial property taxes. So that's $300 million. Now maybe we carve out some exemptions for small business, but we have to keep that in mind that we can't pass that cost burden on to local and county and city governments, or their only option is to cut essential services or raise property taxes, which is regressive for particularly our residentials. We need to, I believe, there's 46 states that tax corporate income in the U.S. 25 of those states tax corporate income on a combined basis. Iowa does not. It puts our Iowa-based businesses and corporations at a disadvantage. And many of those national corporations are taking advantage of the Iowa law and shifting income out of the state, shifting expenses into the state. If we made that the same, that's at least $100 million in revenue for the state. That increases the tax fairness for our existing Iowa businesses.
What about corporate? What about federal deductibility? That was
I think
was
that
part
I
of the
think
law.
I think that was good. I mean, we've been struggling with how to get rid of federal deductibility for years. I think when Iowans are going to have a smaller tax burden now from the federal tax cuts, that we could have made some effort to increase the progressivity of our income tax system and not accommodate all that tax cut for the wealthy Iowans. But I think it makes us more competitive in appearance with our tax rate in Iowa. There are another number of other things I think we should look at. We should look at our regional and national banks basically escape the franchise fee in Iowa, putting our Iowa banks and community banks at a disadvantage. That's at a minimum a $20 million revenue swing. That again increases fairness for Iowa businesses that were a deal cut with by the lobby to advantage regional and national banks. We need to change many of our business tax credits to deductions so that businesses and corporations who aren't paying Iowa taxes don't get a check from Iowa taxpayers. That is estimated to be in the $30 million range. That creates a more fair tax system. I noticed that in this tax bill they allowed teachers to deduct the expense for buying supplies for the classroom. Only a deduction for teachers, but we give businesses tax credits so they actually get a check from Iowa taxpayers but pay no taxes in Iowa. That's an indicator of who's got the control of this legislature and governor with the corporate lobby. So you look at rolling back commercial and property income tax break, look at combined corporate federal taxation, making the bank system more fair. If you raise minimum wage, our biggest tax credit in Iowa is the earned income tax credit, about $72 million a year. Well, you raise the minimum wage and raise earning in this state, you lower the expense on the earned income tax credit as well. So I list.
Before we go away from revenues, what about the 3/8 penny sales tax?
I've advocated for, with reluctance because I know it's regressive, but I'd like to go to 5/8 cents, so the extra quarter cent goes towards tuition assistance for low-income families. So they are able to, again, break that cycle of poverty, get them into our education system, and change that life direction for them.
Would that just be for public schools,
for regions and community colleges and private colleges?
Public
Yes.
schools.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't ask when we were talking about education, but would you maintain or increase or cut back money for so-called school choice, public funds, either tax credits, et cetera,
Yes.
for people who stand that?
Yes.
Yes, which?
Yes, and we should not be subsidizing private schools at the expense of our public schools. I mean, I just, I grew up going to public schools, and I just think public schools are one of the most foundational values in our state. They provide the equal opportunity for everyone in this state to succeed, and we should not be shifting resources away from public schools. It just is another example how we're increasing that economic disparity in Iowa by creating more advantages for those folks who can afford to go to a private school, and then tax subsidizing them. We've got to get at this growing divide between income in this state. The question was asked in the debate last night: how do we control Medicaid costs? Well, one of the ways you control Medicaid costs is increase incomes and get people off of Medicaid. Foundationally, that's the long-term goal we have to have.
Since you brought up, there's a lot of ways we can go, but since you brought up Medicaid, do you roll back privatization? And if so, if the state is managing Medicaid, how do you manage it so that you have a predictable expense from year to year?
Well, I think it will definitely be more predictable if we bring it back in. One of the problems when they privatized it was those insurance companies looking to turn a profit, it's a problem through our society. There's very little patient capital anymore. Everyone wants a quick profit. And the expectations they were going to turn a quick profit on the Medicaid dollars and improve services was foundationally just unsound. So we had a 4% overhead before. Now it's about a 15% overhead. That's the only way they're turning that quick profit is to deny services, which is creating bigger, higher-end healthcare costs in the back end. So we've got to, I think, have a state-managed Medicaid system that is focused on patient care, but also focused on long-term healthcare costs. We have growing obesity in this state. Poverty is a big contributor to an increasing Medicaid costs. Our growing elderly population and keeping people in the home longer and providing home care services versus nursing home, which is a higher expense option. We need to have managed care. And the state should run a state-administered managed care program but more focused on how do we bring these trend lines down for costs based on a healthier and long-term look. The insurance companies right now, they're only looking at how can they turn a quick profit by denying services, and that's wreaking havoc on so many families.
Part of the argument for-profit managed care is that the profit margin spurs these companies to make their work more efficient, to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and to just really have a more efficient operation than the state could have.
Well, why is that?
Do you feel like we're not seeing that?
Why can the state not run an efficient operation if you commit to working it? Obviously, we're seeing how this administration values state workers and they strip away collective bargaining rights, and they're constantly blaming state workers for failure. It's a failure of leadership. I was Governor Vilsack's chief of staff. We entrusted and empowered workers. You hold them accountable, just like the private sector will, but you don't have to carve out the profit margin. So there's no reason why a well-run state-administered managed care operation can't be just as efficient as the private sector, because their incentive is to maximize profits. Our incentive, our purpose in Medicaid should be to maximize health care outcomes for Iowans.
Part of what was driving that collective bargaining legislation was health care. That bargaining for health care in all the different bargaining units around the state led to a bunch of different little healthcare plans where it could be more efficient, bring school boards together perhaps, or county governments, private governments, bring those healthcare plans together. Do you see any value in trying to continue with that if you also say, okay, we're gonna restore these collective bargaining rights?
They erected all kinds of boogeymen to justify their stripping away collective bargaining rights. That wasn't one of them. Listen, there's nothing to prevent school districts, county governments to collaborate. They have great associations of the counties, great school associations in the state of Iowa that certainly have the opportunity, if they see the ability to create efficiencies by collaborating on health care plans. Their agenda was to strip away collective bargaining rights, and now it's being shifted onto the workers, which you're seeing across this state, an increase in their share of the health care costs they're expected to contribute. So their savings has been strictly on the backs of workers, not on creating efficiencies. I was in western Iowa last week, and there's a school district over there. This is their non-professional employees. They gave them a 1 cent raise this year.
Where? What school district is that?
It's either Manning or Manila. And that's what I was told at my community forum. That's not only a pay cut for those individuals, it's really a slap in the face. And we have some great county, city governments and school boards that are trying to cooperate and not having this impact on teachers. But this legislation purposely prevented them from voluntarily negotiating those. This is a worse law than Wisconsin passed. And this is why Minnesota's stealing our young teachers right now.
if you win the primary, you'll be facing Governor Reynolds in the fall. First, I want to ask you how you're going to beat her, but first I want to ask, is there anything that she's done so far that you agree with?
Well, as I said before on the mental health issue, she has at least recognized we have a huge failure in the mental health system. So I'll give her credit for that, but that's kind of a hollow credit if you don't put any resources behind it. I think her energy plan, when she was lieutenant governor, was a good blueprint for our energy future, but she's taken no action to implement it. But I was pleased that, and this is 2 or 3 or 4 years old, but that I think she recognizes the opportunity for renewable energy in Iowa. But again, she hasn't shown any leadership on it to push it through the legislature. We have tremendous opportunity to alter the course of ag production and be a way to sequester carbon, rebuild soil health, lower their input costs, lower the fuel costs, and shifting. My vision here is we need to be the state that sets the example, not just for the country, but for the world, on how we produce food. Because we have shifted to a high input, high output, no profit agricultural system. Nearly 90% of the wealth created by our food production has gone to agribusiness industry, and we're backfilling the income for farmers with taxpayer dollars. The future, because we cannot continue to dump megatons of fertilizer and chemicals and using fuel in our agricultural production, or we're going to end up like the coal industry in 20 years with depleted asset and the income having left the state and us with a mess to clean up. So I want us to be the state that uses technology and farms more efficiently, lower the input costs, lower the emissions, lower the energy use, and create a different path forward for how food production is done in Iowa and the world, because we have to save our food production system here in Iowa and across the country. So I got off on a tangent there, but
before you go off on that, almost everything that gets done in agriculture in Iowa is voluntary, or it's done through money incentives, right? So we've got our nutrient reduction strategy. The legislature just funneled a little bit more money into that to try to encourage farmers to take care of soil and water conservation practices if they're not doing them already. This is a much bigger change for producers to get their heads around. So how do you get people on board with that? Are you doing it with money? Are you gonna require? Or you do it through regulation, or do you take the slow road of convincing people one at a time?
listen, we've developed this culture and practice of farming over decades, which has been a result of federal ag policies, driving farmers to get more production off that acre of land to be eligible for more payments and crop insurance, and we've driven this way. So we've got to recognize the transition is not going to happen overnight, but there are a number of things we need to start doing to make it happen. We have 60,000 miles of land bordering rivers and streams and lakes in this state. The federal ag program will pay the market rate for rental for the land taken out of production and put into buffer strips. Now, farmers don't want to do that because they want to farm right up to that creek bed because they're so strapped right now economically. This year will be the lowest farm income in the last 12 years, and we've dropped half of the farm income in the last 5 years. So but we have to reach out to those landowners, of which 50% now are absentee landowners, and talk to them about they can get just as amount of rent from that acre next to the field strip, to the stream edge and river's edge, if we put that in the grass water strips. So there's no reason why that can't be happening right away. If we want to take farmers' land out of production that they're leveraged up against with debt, then there's going to have to be some cost share. We can't expect them, you put them in that economic situation of where they're already leveraged against that land and taken out of production without some cost share. We have to ramp up public research. Zeroing out the funding for the Leopold Center was the exact opposite of what we should be doing, because all the research being done now at ISU was paid for by those chemical input companies, Monsanto and ConAgra and you name it, all trying to perpetuate the style of farming we're doing now, which is dependent upon megatons of fertilizer and chemical dropped in that land. We should be doubling or tripling the funding for Leopold Center to do public research about how to enable farmers to understand how they can transition out of this hamster wheel they're on and increase profitability, but also rebuild soil health. And if you rebuild soil health, you clean up the nitrates and phosphates that are getting our runoff supply. So it's public research, it's leveraging those grass waterways, and the simple deployment of cover crops. We know if we have up to 50% of our land in Iowa in cover crops, that'll essentially eliminate the nitrate and phosphate runoff problem, and it begins to rebuild soil health. And over 5 years, farmers then start to turn a profit on that because of the rebuilt soil health and the need for less chemical inputs. So what I think we need to do is bridge that 5 years with incentives for farmers to convert, and public education and extension to convert that land into cover crops. If we don't clean up our water supply, and the water bill was useless because there's no measuring or monitoring in it, which is exactly what they wanted. So they can kick the can down the road saying, oh, let's give it time to work, but then we'll never know if it's working. We have to have serious measurement and monitoring of our water, and we have to deploy these efforts to change this practice of farming. But at the end of the day, if there's not improvement, there has to be accountability.
Let me circle back to the original question about beating Kim Reynolds. You first have to get through the primary. You face some better funded and opponents with the bigger name ID. We're getting down to the wire here. How do you break out in the primary, and what's your strategy for beating Kim Reynolds?
Well, how I break out in the primary is doing what I've been doing. I mean, I know I'm the shoe leather and tie rubber candidate in this campaign. We knew when we started. I said in the debate last night, when Fred stopped by my house before I got in the race to discourage me from running, he said, John, you can't win, I'm going to have all the money. I didn't let that deter me. And because I think Iowans expect to meet the candidate, and we've been traveling the state, meeting voters since last July, getting a great response, because I think what I'm finding people want is somebody who has some experience, who could start turning this state around day one, and recognition that we can't win the governor's race. And it's not just about winning the governor's race for me. I think they've done some serious damage to the future of Iowa these last two sessions, or last year and this year, that we have to also elect more progressive legislators. And that's the real power of that governor's office, is to change the conversation in this state that empowers more progressive legislators to get elected. And what I'm finding as I cross the state is people recognize that. If we don't win back and have a vision for rural Iowa and deserve to win back rural Iowa's votes, we can't win the governor's race, and we can't win back the state legislature. So I feel like we're picking up steam with people recognizing that. There's not a huge differences between all of us on policy. There are differences. I mean, last night we saw one where Fred was not for repealing this tax cut, and I was for it. And so there's, I think Cathy and I are the only two who have called for a moratorium on concentrated animal feeding operations until we completely redo the master matrix. Other candidates have expressed concern about that, but no one else has called for that. So there are some policy differences, but at the end of the day, folks want someone who's progressive and can win. And none of us had great name ID going into this. Fred certainly enhanced his name ID with the $5 or $6 million he spent to try and influence this election. But I'm confident at the end of the day, voters expect to meet us, and we've done well with those voters we've met, and we'll continue to do that.
We had talked to you at some point about a convention strategy. Is that still, do you think, a live round that not only that could this race go to convention, but that you could make inroads that way?
I think we're running a primary campaign and a convention campaign. You don't want to wait until after that primary, and not getting 35%, and no one gets 35%, and then start a convention strategy. So we have really from last fall recognized this could go convention, and so we're reaching out to delegates, reached out to the caucuses and the county conventions to have a presence there. So I think it's really a bifurcated campaign. And on to your question about Kim Reynolds. You know, I think her biggest weakness is the total mismanagement of our budget and state government. The Medicaid privatization being a prime example, the failure to fund mental health care, the underfunding for education, the deficit that's been created on her watch. And every time I talk to Democratic groups, I feel it's my responsibility to equip them and empower them to make the argument for me with their neighbor against Kim Reynolds. And the response has been really positive from folks. Thank you. Thank you for giving all me this policy detail. Thank you for giving me the background of my experience in business and government and policy. No one even comes close in this race to my depth of policy on agriculture and energy, which are two critical areas for Iowa's future.
In order to beat Kim Reynolds, so it's not just Democrats you have to win over. You have to win over the independents and maybe moderate Republicans. So what aspect of your message of your campaign do you think appeals most, or why are you the candidate who could appeal best to those groups that are critical in the general election?
Because when I'm out at these coffee shops meeting with local Democrats, I always stop at the other table in the restaurant and have conversations with folks. And, you know, they care about the same things that I care about. And those Democrats I just talked to, those fundamental Iowa values of that love and respect for the land, sense of caring and community, and that belief in public education. They're worried about, as I mentioned before, all political faiths out there are worried about where our public education system is going. You just had a superintendent, I forget what school district in Northwest Iowa, just gave a great talk to his school board this past week about concerns about the future of schools. There's a hospital administrator in Northwest Iowa, far Northwest Iowa, who showed up at the Democratic caucus, been a long-time Republican, saying I've had it because of this Medicaid privatization. When I sat down with a table full of probably 65 and older white guys up in Sanborn, Iowa, I doubt one of them was a Democrat. But you know, I introduced myself, sat down at the table. I don't know if they'll vote for me, but I know next fall, when they try and make me out to be this two-headed monster, they're going to try and do. They're going to say, we talked to that guy. That's not what he's about. Because they're worried about their school. They're worried about their hospital. They're worried about their workforce. They were extremely concerned about Steve King's hot rhetoric against immigrants because they know that's their labor supply right now for their dairy farms and their business and industry in Northwest Iowa. So, and when I take on this anti-immigrant sentiment out there, I'll get some business owners afterwards come up to me and say, thanks for saying that. I think they're hesitant because they need that third of the people in their community. They need their business, so they can't be as forceful. But they said, thanks for addressing that. You create space for us to change the conversation in our community. So there's a lot of disenchanted, worried people throughout Iowa, particularly rural Iowa, that if we have a message of hope and what we're going to do to help rebuild the rural Iowa economy, we'll win back those votes.
If you look at recent history in Iowa, more often than not, the governor has to deal with at least one chamber controlled by the opposite party, if not both. What experience have you had working with the Republicans on issues, and can you point to a success that you've had working with the opposite party? Certainly.
When I would chair Governor Vilsack's electric restructuring committee, we had about 50 to 75 people from all political faiths, and environmentalists to utility company executives to cooperatives. And that was about a 2-year process where I met with them every month, pushing forward on a resolution to concerns about our long-term energy supply in the state. And we got to the real nub, which was that concern that will we have enough electric generation in Iowa for our economy and build the future. There was the reason I took this over when I was Governor Vilsack's chief of staff was we didn't hire anybody to do energy policy. At that time, really, renewable fuels was the only, and Dusky handled that as our ag person. Then we learned about this group that had been meeting to try and deregulate Iowa's electric industry. So I said to Governor Vilsack, I said, we better get in the middle of this or we're going to get some legislation that we may not want to see. And he asked me who we'd hire to do energy policy, and I said, well, we didn't. He said, well, you said you want to do a policy area. There you go. And so I threw myself into it and fell in love with it. But at the end of the day, we did not deregulate, which was a great move, and they were headed that way before I stepped in. And we developed the advanced rate-making principles, which led to Iowa's wind energy build-out that is now resulting in our capacity to be over half of our state beyond renewable energy. And that's what I enjoyed the most about being chair of the Utilities Board and on the Federal Energy Commission. Because when you do energy policy, at the end of the day, Ohm's law is not political. And you have to be honest with facts and data, because if you don't, the whole electric grid comes down. So that's how I approach policy: is facts, data, information, and hold people accountable to their positions if they don't align with that. When I'm governor, there's a conference table in that governor's office, probably not quite this big. We got to put the training wheels back on our democracy. We've lost the capacity to work together across the aisle. Part of it's lack of transparency and sharing information. But I'm going to identify with that group of Republican and Democratic leaders what is the easiest problem we all agree needs to get resolved. And we're going to figure out how to resolve it. And then the next more difficult problem becomes that much easier because you have learned how to work together again. Now, we'll still find differences on some of the big issues that will not be resolved, and that's where the power of that governor's office is to then leave that table and go out to Iowans, make your case, provide them real data, real information, and put pressure on those legislators to go that direction. But that's an open, honest debate that democracy should flourish in. We don't have open, honest debates about policy anymore. It's all behind the doors. And that's why that corporate lobby is so influential, because they have access to the back door. We've got to stop that access.
Would you, other than the way you would operate in the governor's office, would you advocate for any changes in the legislative process to make that process more transparent, deal with some of the problems that you just mentioned?
Yep. Unless you deal with confidential information or personal information, everything should be open to the public. I've even toyed with putting a video cam in the governor's office. You want to come in and ask for a special deal? Don't just tell me. Make your case to Iowans why it benefits them. When I was chair of the Utilities Board, I got there and found out that almost all their decisions they went into closed session to make. And I said to the staff, we're not doing that anymore. Unless it's trade secrets, confidential information that companies had a right to protect, we're going to have an open conversation in front of the public about how we're making our decisions. And the staff at first went, oh, well, you realize what you're doing here? I said, yeah, I realize what I'm doing here. We're helping inform the public as to how we arrive at the decision so that they can make better decisions about how to move forward in their business investment or what concerns we had and they can address. And I changed the culture there about how you hold discussions about decision making. That was on the regulatory side. Legislature needs to do the same thing.
Before we go away from talking about energy, the legislature did what they called an omnibus energy bill this year. The part that got the most press was dealing with the rolling back or capping the energy efficiency programs. But there were other. There was a bigger bill there. What was your take on that? And are you concerned about how that bill will affect energy customers in the future?
Well, yes. Like I said, I took great pride I took great pride just myself, but I talked all over the country about Iowa's energy efficiency programs. And people were in awe and envy, and other states model it after ours. And now we just threw that out the window. We're going to see it impact consumers. We're going to see it impact our capacity to lower emissions and impact on climate change and impact our economy. And it's all because of that backdoor corporate lobby wanted to change it for their own profit. So some things you do have to do for the public good. And I'll have to admit with you, I had heard that they took out stripping away the solar tax credit. I haven't had a chance to see if they did that or not. I'm hopeful they did, because that's the last piece of information I heard. But I saw a briefing paper that said
that was in the income tax bill, right?
Yeah.
So there was a solar tax credit and geothermal, and I went looking at one point, and I still can't quite figure out whether they took it out or not.
Maybe somebody's watching and they'll let us
Yes.
know afterwards. But listen, the solar industry is just starting to take off in this state. Literally over 1,000 jobs right now. And we had if they did that, it'll kill it. We had a roadblock set up by a utilities board decision to change the net metering process in the Alliant Energy District that is going to hamper solar development there, which I think is one of the factors why Decorah tried to set their own municipality. They're doing great stuff up in northeast Iowa in this conservation district that I think we ought to look at modeling across the state. We have conservation districts for land and water. We should have conservation districts for energy use and make Iowa a model there's jobs associated with this, there's income associated with this, and long-term savings for consumers if we be more cognizant about how we use energy and what kind of energy we use in this state.
That's really interesting. And I can't believe we're very close to the end of our hour. First of all, Carol, Brandy, is there anything that you wanted to be sure to ask?
I think you've addressed this throughout our whole interview, but I want to put a finer point on it. If Fred Hubbell is the presumptive front runner right now, and you're talking to someone who says, "I think I'm going to vote for Fred on June 5," why should I switch my vote to you?
Well, I've been hesitant to go after Fred. We got a little bit mixed last night, but first of all, we haven't had very many governors from Des Moines in the last 100 years. Maybe Bob Ray. Some had moved here. Fred's quintessential Des Moines. And that's making it hard. I don't know if he connects with rural Iowans. He doesn't connect with small business owners like me. I mean, listen, he was a business executive, but he inherited his business position. He didn't start it from scratch like I did, borrowing $5,000 from my folks who were hard-pressed. And I think I identify more with that small business owner in that rural community and those farmers than Fred can connect with on. I think... Listen, I've went through 2 FBI and White House personnel investigations in my background before I got confirmed with the Senate twice. And no one else in this campaign has been vetted like I have. So, not that I would have wanted to anyway, but there are some issues in Fred's background I think that Kim Reynolds will know about that may become issues in this campaign. But we haven't had a chance to really have any vetting. But I think I'd tell people, listen, my whole life's been out there on public display, going through 2 Senate confirmations. There's no surprises. So I think the element of surprise, the fact that Fred talks about he's never been a politician. I don't think when you run for the top political job in the state that it's an asset to have no experience. And I also think it's kind of disingenuous because he certainly has experience in politics. He's been playing as a donor and a player in politics for decades. When he's CEO of the company, there's politics involved in that. There was politics involved in that Iowa Power Fund because I sat in the same board with Fred. So I think you got to be honest with Iowans. And playing this game about I'm not a politician cuts both ways. Some disingenuousness in saying it. Maybe even more importantly is, you really want to tout yourself to be the CEO of the state and the chief political person of the state, and you think having no experience is an asset? I think he's shown some of those mistakes in the campaign. Calling organized labor corrupt, I think, was a mistake. And so I'd say, do you really want someone who's experienced in business, government, ag policy, energy policy, that can step in day one, know what I'm doing? Or do you think Fred is the best contrast to Kim Reynolds in the fall, when he really has no connection to those rural communities and rural Iowans and the lives they're going through and what they've gone through? And I don't usually get that negative, but it is a contrast. We come from different backgrounds. I have always fought my life for social and economic justice. You know, when Fred was a Wall Street lawyer making profits for corporate America, I was marching with Cesar Chavez in California for environmental justice for workers. You know, I was organizing the Farm Unity Coalition to help save struggling family farmers. Fred's, I don't know how many times he said, well, when I was head of Yonkers, that was during the farm crisis. And then he even claims credit for starting Farm Aid when Willie Nelson started Farm Aid, and there was only been one Farm Aid concert in Iowa in 1993, and I ran it. And Fred wasn't even with Yonkers then. So I just don't kind of see where he's going to go with this narrative that he understands rural Iowa and what the connection is. I think he's trying to, but the bottom line is there's not much.
All right. Last question. Why should the Des Moines Register endorse you?
Well, shamelessly, I would say because I'm so proud of my 3 sons. Every morning we fight over the Des Moines Register at the breakfast table. Who gets the sports section? Who gets the front page section? So you know, I'd certainly like to have my boys fight over the endorsement section of the Des Moines Register. I've committed my life to public service. From when I grew up volunteering for Tom Harkin when I was in junior high to working for him out of college, to running that Farm Unity Coalition, to running, you know, campaigns in Iowa, to being active in my local chamber of commerce when I was a business owner, to being Governor Vilsack's chief of staff, to then being chair of the Utilities Board, on the Federal Energy Commission. Believe me, I had multiple opportunities to cash in and make a whole lot more money after working in those government sectors and high responsibility I had. I never chose that because I've never been involved in politics or government for my own personal gain. I've always been involved about how you make a difference for the people that I'm working for. So I would say, look at my life example. And what I've tried to do in my entire life, and the experience I have stepping in that office day one to really change the direction of this state and the ability and capacity to get it done. I didn't think I'd run on experience, because I've experienced that mattered that much we'd have a different president. But it does matter. And I think it matters to Iowans, and it'll matter in this election next November.
Right. That's all the time we have. Thanks to John Norris for your time. The 5 other Democratic candidates for governor have also met with the Des Moines Register, as well as the 3 Democrats running in the contested primary for Iowa's 3rd district, and the 2 Libertarian candidates running for governor. You can see all of those videos on DesMoinesRegister.com, as well as all the news and updates on the primary election and